And so, throughout the year, we'll be exploring our own personal healing, of course, which involves an alchemical process, if you like, of illuminating, holding, and tending to those wounds around love, which are relational wounds arising out of our early biographical history, the various forms of relational trauma, attachment patterning, narcissistic wounding, and a variety of other types of betrayal in soma and psyche and soul. And these wounds that we all come into adulthood with, when left unattended or unmetabolized or uncompanioned, they have a way of generating a type of disconnection, within ourselves, with others, with nature, with the sacred. And they leave behind a shadow of what we'll explore this year as what we sometimes refer to as our unlived life or as the unlived life, which it turns out, at least in my experience, is that it's always longing to find us and has its own unique ways of reaching out. And I think it's this reunion with the unlived, with what I sometimes refer to as the lost orphans of psyche and soma, with the scattered pieces of soul that can bring such a vitality and such a joy and that felt sense of wholeness into our lives, which I think many of us are really longing for. And also in connection with a profound sense of meaning, which I know that some of us, many of us, have lost contact with, at least in part. And so we might say that that's the psychological side of this work, or the personal healing aspect of it, is tending to those wounds around love. Because if we trace back all of our psychological, emotional wounding, we might see that in the end, that it's all organized around that core wound around love. They're always relational wounds that arise out of relationship. And in my experience anyway, they're best illuminated or held, worked through, transformed within a relational field, which is one of the reasons that we do these sorts of groups, to sort of invite each of us into that sort of field, as a way for us to really touch into that and into its transformative power, intelligence, mercy, beauty, grace. And it's just not possible to always do that on our own, to heal, to transform the wounds around love. No shame, no blame, no apology for that. We're just not wired that way. We're just not crafted that way as relational beings. We don't have that kind of nervous system. We have these open, sensitive mirror neurons and nervous systems, these alive sort of resonant circuitries that long for connection. We long to feel felt, and we're just wired to connect, to untangle those wounds around love within relationship, within that sort of field. So we might say that that's the more psychological or the therapeutic side of the work of that we'll be looking at together this year. And then on the more spiritual side, just to use that word, which is a bit vague, of course, and we're going to have to unfold that a bit together. But for now, speaking more transpersonally, there's also a disconnection, a sort of breaking and linkage, a more spiritual or primordial dissociation with, a disconnection with what we might call our essential nature, with being itself, with God, with Gaia, with the beloved, with the divine, with spirit, with the great mystery. However we've come to image and language the totality, that mysterious reality which is larger than ourselves. And we all have our unique ways of imaging that. And so I think from the spiritual side, we're speaking about the experience of a reconnection or a reunion, a felt knowing of unity between each of us, as individuals, and ultimate reality itself, that radical felt sense of non-separation and the inherent sort of joy in that, playfulness in that, the capacity to be and live and move and breathe from those unstructured states like awe and wonder and just the joy of being itself, that which is causeless. It's a joy that's causeless. It's not dependent upon the fulfillment of my hopes and fears. It's always already here. And so these two paths, individual healing and that more transpersonal or spiritual realization, while it can be helpful, I think, to speak about them separately as two things, as a way to emphasize one or the other in a given moment, which we'll do. I think one of the real discoveries of this journey, again, at least in my experience, is that they're linked together in often mysterious ways, ways that our culture tends not to understand. And that includes our therapy and spiritual subcultures as well. That in fact, they're not two paths, but they're one path. And there's an alive, but again, mysterious relationship between tending to our own unresolved relational wounding, which is an illumination of the unlived life in all of its forms and manifestations. There's a link between that and a greater oneness or a unity with what we might call the divine ground, that the line between these two isn't quite as bright as we may have imagined or we may have learned. I mean, in some ways, it's only in the contemporary world, in the last 100 years or so, when we've been able to perceive it in this way. The great insights and discoveries of depth and somatic psychologies and psychotherapies, relational and contemplative neuroscience, attachment theory, and how all of this sort of weaves together in an embodied, soulful, integral approach to healing and spiritual realization.